So the world is divided over the war in Ukraine, over the war in Yemen, the relations between United States and China. You know, Chuck Hagel, who was the former American Defense Secretary in President Obama's administration, once said, "Foreign policy is a universe of bad decisions." Now, I don't know, but I think Hillary Clinton, who was in charge of foreign policy at that time, would have said that, oh yeah, right, and defense policy is a multiverse of disasters. So what can we expect from the ongoing geopolitical rivalries that we are seeing in the world today? C. Raj Mohan is from the Asia Society Asia Society Institute in New Delhi. And he has written a book on China-India rivalry. And he will talk to us today now about bridging a fragmented world, a view from the East. Raj Mohan?
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. It's my first time here, and it's really a great pleasure and an opportunity for me to be with you and interact with you on the question of a fragmenting world and how do we bridge it. I don't think I can match Sandrine's eloquence, but what I can do is really to bring a different perspective from a different corner of the world. Hopefully, that's of some value for our deliberations this afternoon. What I thought I'll do is really to look at how we in the East look at the fragmentation that is going on. At least I talk about 3 trends of fragmentation. But there's also good news, which is really at least 2 trends of integration that are happening in the world today. So I'm also going to talk about them. And within that, what kind of a role can India play in bridging this divides and how we can actually integrate more in the days ahead. So the first question, I'm sure many of you really wonder why so many people in the East or the global South have not reacted the way you would have expected them to the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think there is a sense that, look, they don't care for this, they don't understand this. But what I would say is the first basic data point itself is that in the UN, most of the developing countries, East or the South, have voted with the resolutions calling for immediate Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. So I think there should be, there's a lot of misperception here. Most people have seen the consequences of this war. We feel the pain of the fragmentation in Europe. The idea that Europe can go through this kind of a brutal war certainly affects all of us. But I think part of the problem in the global South has been our sense of Soviet Union, which supported national liberation at a time when the Europeans were the colonial and the imperial powers. The lingering legacy of that is attached to Russia. For many of us, as we were beginning to fight European imperialism in the interwar period, Soviet Union and the United States were the only 2 countries that said liberation is necessary. So I think the attachment to Russia as a force for liberation remains deep across the political classes. So that's one part of the problem. And I think we're not sufficiently engaged with Europe to understand Russia's own imperial behavior historically within Europe. And I think we need a lot more dialogue there for us to get a better sense of European history, which we don't have. The second aspect is the fact that Europe and the West in general have largely taken the developing world for granted. We tell you what the rules are, just abide by them. There has been no political engagement after the end of the Cold War. And over the last 30 years, the sense that you really don't need them. But when you're suddenly in a war and you turn to them and say, guys, why aren't you raising your hand with us? So I think there are problems there. So I think what we need is really a lot more engagement between India and Europe on the issues of Ukraine, both in terms of its causes and consequences, as well as the effects of this on the global south, that is a big issue, and I think we need to talk about it a lot more. The second fragmenting force today is the deglobalization. For almost 30 years, we were told in Asia, look, guys, you've got to open up your markets, open up your economies. The only answer for growth is to open up and globalize and liberalize at home. So we've been very good students in Asia, learned this lesson rather well, and suddenly, now we are told, oh, sorry, you're exporting too much. You're creating unemployment in the developing world. So therefore, the rules are going to change. Just when we seem to be ready to be integrated into a globalized economy, we said, no, this is not going to work. Whether it is Europe's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the American sense that, look, you need to change the rules to stop either China or India, a whole lot of other countries that are exporting to the United States. So I think there are new rules. But I think I see, as a realist, that we got to deal with this problem, that the developing world, whatever the historical sequencing of this might have been, we cannot keep growing without a partnership with the West. So therefore, when we need to change the rules because globalization is not working for everyone. So how do we create a new set of rules? That is the challenge. And I think there again, we need to work together. Third, while we talk about fragmenting forces, there is a tendency now to frame the issues as North versus the South or the East versus the West. This, I think, completely misrepresents the conflicts within the East. There are as many internal divisions within the East and the South as there are today within the West, we see in the war in Ukraine. Those of you, I know Europe loves China. You've got a lot of business in China. But what we see is the problem in Europe of Russian aggression is not different from Xi Jinping's aggressive behavior in Asia. It's interesting, both of them have a lot of similarities. Both of them want more territory. I don't think these two large countries want more territory. But the fact that they have claims for territory of their neighbors, and the fact that they're equipped with nuclear weapons, therefore, we have the impunity to change borders by using force. The problem you face in Europe is exactly the problem India faces on its borders with China, of what Vietnam faces, what Philippines faces. So I think you've got to see this. It's not just Europe that's having a problem, that we also have problems in Asia. And I think the similarities are not often understood. So we see, well, why are the Indians silent on what's happening in Ukraine? We see the Europeans equally silent because you've got business interests in China. I mean, I understand the logic of the business interests, but I think here again, if we want a more integration, we need to talk to each other more. And that brings me to the two integrating factors that are unfolding. One is you're going to see more of Asia and Europe. And we are preparing to see even more of West in Europe. And I think this is something not intuitive. Consider, for example, in the Ukraine war, South Korea is selling arms to Poland that are being directed to Ukraine, South Korea. There was a time we used to complain, the Western arms merchants, they're going to sell arms, produce, prolonged conflicts in the developing world. Today, you have South Korea selling arms to Ukraine via Poland. You have Iran selling drones to Russia, which are being used with some effect in Ukraine. So what you have then is it's the old assumptions about what Asia is merely a passive actor, and that Asia has no agency. It's really the Europeans who set the rules for 400 years. I think that's fundamentally wrong. A risen Asia is going to influence outcomes in Europe. And I think we're just beginning to see the process. And far more consequential than what South Korea does, what Iran does, is the fact that China backs Russia. We thought European theater, the Asian theater were different. Today, the Sino-Russian alliance makes the two theaters into a single global complex. And I think we're already seeing, as more Asia comes into Europe, we're beginning to see NATO, Norway is a NATO member, and NATO coming into Asia. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the leaders of these countries attended the last two NATO summits. I know the French have blocked setting up a NATO office in Tokyo, But the fact is, there is actually going to be a lot more integration because the problems, the security problems of Europe and Asia can no longer be separated. And what we're going to see is a much greater integration of this. So that brings me to the last point. Where does India come into this? Now, I believe that India can actually play and is poised to play a bridging role in many ways in the challenges that we face today. Today, thanks to the divisions within Asia, India has long believed in building a common Asia, an Asia in which India and China work together. To one way today, India is far more open to working with the West to build a new geopolitical order across the world. It's not just a question of being anti-China. There is a question of being anti-revisionism, a question of following basic rules of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think to get that, this is not just a European problem. As we said, there's an Asian problem in which Japan, India, Philippines, Vietnam, a whole range of countries are affected by territorial revisionism. So therefore, I think we have actually a bridging effect between Europe and Asia now that is possible. India is an active potential player in bridging this. Equally, on the North-South issues today, our leaders today, India talks about resurrecting the global South. But we're not going back to a non-aligned movement that framed the global issues as a conflict between developed and developing countries. But today, I think any solution that we need for climate change, we've heard so much about it in the previous speaker, to issues of food security, energy security, all these issues demand a cooperation between North and South. This cannot be solved as simply the responsibility of one side or the other. And here is where I think India can play this role as a bridging state between the North and South, besides being a bridging state, because hopefully India can help eventually contribute to negotiating some kind of a peaceful settlement in the current war in Europe. The other issue on which I think India will play a crucial role, in which all Norway and the Nordics should be interested, is in the energy transition. The previous speaker talked about, it's not just changing the human nature, but I don't think you can change human nature. We need technology. We need new forms of technology to alter the core of the climate change problem. What is the relationship between the nature of energy we use and the kind of economy we want to build? Therefore, we need technology, which good old Marx once said is the forces of production. We also need a change in the relations of production, which is what Sandrine was emphasizing. That is, how do classes relate to each other within a society? Because the moment you talk about climate change, the problem is finally about the costs of that, how those costs are distributed within nations and across nations. I think this requires, new ways of doing things, that is technology, as well as new ways of relating to each other. And I think there, India can play a crucial role. And I would just conclude with this thought, Anita, which is the Indian talent today is much sought after. We're seeing Indian talent, what it has done in the United States. And that for solving most of the problems in the world today, Indian talent at a time when Europe's population is declining. You need more Indians. So I'm not talking about immigration issue. We can talk about it in the question and answer. But the fact is, how do you bring the Indian talent to solve some of the problems of Europe and of the world? Thank you for your attention.
Well, we brought one Indian talent here, so that's one to go. Thank you so much. It was a beautifully structured speech, starting with all the forces of fragmentation and then the forces of integration. The way things are, has international geopolitics become a football game without referees and rules?
But it's always been the case, right? It's when we say good old Hobbes, who said, look, it's really, there's no supreme authority over states. But what we tried to do in the post-war world was to really create the United Nations, to create some set of rules, and hoping that those rules will manage an anarchic world. But I think we seem to be getting there. But what we saw, what Putin did in Europe, what Xi Jinping does in Asia, fundamentally, when the big boys violate rules, what do you do? How do you deal with those rules? And I think this is where new coalitions are needed to deter this kind of expansionism or the sense of nuclear impunity by those who own nuclear weapons and can change borders. So I think this requires, because without rules, the disaster, and we need more cooperation to get that done.
We have one question from the audience. How will India work towards reform of multilateral institutions, including the UN?
Look, I think UN is not the only way to go forward, because I don't see the Russians and the Chinese letting in, or the European Union, for example. Do you think they'll keep one seat and give the other two to somebody else? They won't. So I think let's be practical. I think the UN system is not going to be changed overnight. What we need is more like-minded coalitions. Whether it's climate change, because in the end, the idea that 180 countries can sit 3 nights without sleeping and can come up with solutions is gone. So I would say the major economies, like-minded countries, need to come together to devise a set of agreements between themselves, and then hoping that that example will create conditions for others to follow. So I would say the UN is jammed on security issues. WTO is jammed on economic issues. So I think we need some major economies to come together and some major polities to come together. Let's at least start agreeing on some rules, and then hope to campaign for those rules to be abided by others.
Best of luck to us. Thank you so much, Raj Mohan. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.